Our topic tonight, the documentary hypothesis versus the supplementary hypothesis. It sounds incredibly technical, but actually this is a very exciting topic, and it's one that is much requested. This is essentially looking at who wrote the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, who wrote the Torah, who wrote the Pentateuch, the 2 primary academic hypotheses for understanding the authorship of that text. And we've previously done a couple lectures on the documentary hypothesis, but this was many years in the past, even before the pandemic, when we were doing these live with a live audience here. And so there's some updates I want to give and some additional information than we had in those earlier lectures. So ancient tradition attributed the authorship of these books, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, called either the Torah, the Law in Judaism, or the Pentateuch, Christianity, the 5 books. So they were attributed, or the authorship was attributed to the leading character of books number 2 through 5, Moses. So although all 5 are organized in a kind of chronological order, the books are not a history, nor are they a chronicle. They don't have an annual dating system the way other chronicles would have when you're saying this occurred in the year of our Lord, or whatever the dating system would be. And so in that sense, they are more like the epic poems, or at the heart of the ancient Greek culture, the Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and Hesiod's works and days. So all the dates that you ever see in a Bible, if you have a study Bible, those are fully hypothetical. Those are different ideas that scholars have about when the story of Moses might have been set, when the story of Abraham might have been set, when the Garden of Eden might have been set, if they hazard a guess, that kind of a thing. Famously, the most famous, I guess, in the West, I think, or the Protestant West, or I'm not sure, Christian West anyway, the most famous guy doing calculation for this is Bishop Ussher, writing in the 17th century, who read all the biblical texts, tried to add all the numbers up in a way that I don't think makes a lot of sense, but nevertheless became something that people really enjoyed doing. And in his calculation, he decided that the Exodus, for example, took place in the year 1491 BC, and he went through and created dates for all of the biblical events. He's certainly not the only one, or the first one even, to have tried this. So medieval rabbis and also late antique Eastern Orthodox priests made their own calculations based on their own readings of the Bible as a history and adding up the dates in order to find a date for the creation, for the very beginning of Genesis. And then they created their own dating systems starting with that date, the date which they theorized the world creation began. So these systems are called Anno Mundi, which is to say the year of the world, as opposed to Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, so AD. This is AM. And the Jewish version of Anno Mundi dates the creation to the Julian calendar anyways, year 3761 BC. Whereas the Byzantine version had a longer calculus, and so it dates actually the year of creation to 5509 BC. And so then their numbering system says this is now the year, in the case of this gravestone, that dates to 1903 or 1904 AD. It has the year 5,664 Anno Mundi. So in other words, in the year since the world was created, 5,664. So the wide ranges of calculations for the universe creation, they're all derived by the same source. So the rabbis, the Byzantines, Bishop Ussher, they all kind of added up numbers that they found in the Bible to get very different calculations. And I think that this kind of shows the folly of trying to use the Bible this way. Certainly, you have to get through, in the middle of it, the early chronology, you have to get through Joshua and especially the book of Judges. And the book of Judges, each judge's rule is just followed by a period of 40 years, and that's very clearly meant as a poetic device. It's essentially saying that a generation passed, so can't be meant as an actual chronology that each one of these guys is set 40 years apart. Rather, it's just saying, and 40 years passed, and now and then Israel forgot Yahweh, and a new people came and tormented them as a result, and then when they remembered Yahweh, they cried out again, then Yahweh raised up a judge, and now Samson delivered them, or something like that. 40 years. So it is not a source for making real chronologies. They're artificial chronologies. The text purpose is never meant to be a history book. Rather, it has a very particular identity formation purpose and teaching moral and religious lessons, and so trying to use it for chronology is misuse and misreading of the text. And in any event, the number of years, just in the thousands, that is still favored by young Earth creationists is not correct, as we have a very now robust scientific cosmological consensus that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. So while the Pentateuch, while the Torah contains no internal chronology and can't be particularly dated just internally, the contemporary Egyptians were actually very significant record keepers, and they have a recorded chronology going all the way back before 3000, before the Common Era, so 5,000 years before present. And so dating of the Exodus has been very popularly coordinated anyway in modern times with the reign of Ramses II, Ramses the Great, which is during the 13th century before the Common Era. So Ramses is one of the greatest pharaohs of Egypt's 19th dynasty during the New Kingdom period. And in the wonderful old movie, The Ten Commandments, Ramses is portrayed by Yul Brynner in a very memorable role, certainly for me. So in contrast to Moses, for whom there is no record outside of the biblical mentions, at least certainly not contemporary to when Moses supposedly would have lived, we just have an amazing amount of historical information about Ramses II, including even having his mummy. And so I presume they're probably also busily getting his DNA so that we can even have that. Like I mentioned, Ramses was one of the great pharaohs of this, certainly the greatest pharaohs of this era, and is the greatest builder since the age of the pyramids, which was hundreds of years in his past. In addition to his building projects, he's a warrior who fought both the Nubians to the south and the Hittites to the north, so expanding Egyptian power and influence. The great temple at Abu Simbel is one of the many structures Ramses built, and the different statues have his likeness. His name in Greek is rendered, so Ramses becomes Ozymandias in Greek, and that inspires the famous poem Ozymandias by Shelley, which talks about how fleeting it is to even think that you can accomplish in life something so great that it will make you immortal, because even a king as great as Ramses, as great as Ozymandias, is only remembered so much. In other words, at a certain point, even all of his very memorable giant statues and the deep cartouches that bear his name, no one can read those anymore. The statues are covered in sand, and people forget about you. And there's only one famous movie about you, and it's just more than half a century old now, that kind of a thing. And the main character is Moses anyway, not Ramses. So Ramses is also the pharaoh who fought the famous Battle of Kadesh, and he fought that against the Hittites. And that battle is especially important because we have records of it in both Hittite and Egyptian sources. One of the first times that happens, where we have contemporary records of a contemporary event from two sides. That's helpful for us because if we only had the Egyptian side, well, it turns out that Egyptian monuments always depict the pharaoh as victorious, but getting the other side of the story from the Hittites, along with kind of the archaeological evidence that shows it's not like Egypt conquered Kadesh and pushed the Hittite frontier back. Rather, there's a treaty that more or less calls it a draw. It shows that the two empires found that to become a natural frontier between one another. So, amidst all of this wealth of information, archaeological and source-wise, that we have about Ramses, we have no trace of the story of the Exodus. So while the movie The Ten Commandments includes an apologetic argument for why that would be, why is there no mention of Moses or the Exodus in Egyptian records? And so in the movie, when Pharaoh Seti, who is Ramses' father, is banishing Moses, he says, "Let the name Moses be stricken from every pylon." So the Egyptians do not want to have this shameful story recorded. However, despite that apologetic, it's really insufficient to explain the total lack of mention. If there had been a series of devastating plagues that destroyed Egypt's power, and then an exodus of at least, let's say, a third to half of the population, all of the slaves that had lived in the Delta, if they had all left suddenly, Egyptian propagandists, this is a negative argument because it's just saying an absence of evidence, but nevertheless, Egyptian propagandists try to put a smiley face on terrible things that happened to them. It's very hard to have omitted something so incredibly important if it actually happened. And just as importantly, the Exodus is entirely anachronistic. So the reason why Ramses fought a battle against the Hittites at Kadesh in Syria is that during the period of the New Kingdom, Egypt had an empire that included control over Canaan. And so any flight of the Israelites from Egypt proper to Canaan would not be liberation from Pharaoh, because Pharaoh ruled both Egypt and Canaan. So it's certainly not set at the time of Ramses. Nevertheless, when we're confronted with these myths, especially with ones that are so central, people tend to really long for finding the kernel of truth behind the myth, because we are so just obsessed with historicity. So scholars agree that as it's written, the Exodus is a myth, like Atlantis or the Aeneid or King Arthur. So there may have been a historical figure named Arthur, but he didn't do any of the things like exist in the Arthur legends. Likewise, no matter how much people want to look for a volcano that exploded in Thera or whatever and say maybe that was Atlantis, that's not what Atlantis is described like in the myth that Plato wrote. And the myth didn't exist before Plato. Plato created it. Aristotle, Plato's student, said, Plato's the one who made this up. This is not a thing. It doesn't come from anywhere. There's no history to it. It's made up. It's made up. And likewise, the Aeneid, as the foundation story for Rome, that Romans are descended from Trojans, is not historical. So this has not stopped people from wanting to search for kernels of truth behind myths. So in some cases, there are potentially actual kernels of truth, or kernels of historicity, we might say, not truth, kernels of historicity behind myths. So the Iliad, the Trojan War, there was a Troy, there was wars, and there is possibly a war that the Greeks maybe didn't fight against the Trojans over, the stealing of Helen, but there may have been an actual war where the Greeks and the Trojans were fighting against the Hittites, who had been forgotten by the time Homer starts composing the Iliad. So in that case, we have identified there being such a thing. People also would like to put the Exodus and Moses potentially at the time period when the Hyksos conquer Egypt. So 4 centuries before Ramses, during Egypt's second intermediate period. So the intermediate periods are when central authority breaks down. The country was invaded both north and south. So the kingdom of Kush invades from the south, and West Asiatic people, known in Egyptian records as the Hyksos, conquer Lower Egypt, that is to say northern Egypt, the Delta and down, and they set up their own dynasty and rule for about a century, so between 1650 BCE and 1550 BCE. And so since the Hyksos are Asiatic, possibly Semitic people, maybe this is when the Exodus would happen. But again, this setting would require a total distortion or obliteration of the Exodus story as it's written, because the Exodus story is not about the patriarch Joseph leading an army into Egypt, conquering the local people and setting himself up as Pharaoh, only to have his descendant, the Pharaoh Moses, routed and kicked back out by some native-born Egyptian dynasty. Like, that's what the Hyksos are. So the story isn't like that at all. The Exodus story is an origin story, an origin myth, about a people leaving slavery and bondage and coming to their own promised land. So part of any people's identity is an origin story. And an origin story is not really important as history. It's actually more important as explaining a people who we are, telling us about our qualities, what makes us who we are. And so it makes use of a narrative, a story, which says where we came from. So in general, when any people are going to have an origin story, they have 2 basic options, which are, 1, we were always here. We're autochthonic. We were here since, we grew out of the rocks. And so we as a people have been here. Other people have come and gone, but we are from this land. This land is ours. That's one of the ways you can tell your origin story. The other option is, you can say, we came from somewhere else. and so we talked about the Aeneid. That's one of the Roman origin stories, which identifies Aeneas as the earliest ancestor of the people who ultimately became the Romans. And Aeneas travels around the Mediterranean, and on his route to Latium, on his route to the place that will be where Rome is founded, he meets, for example, Dido, the legendary founder of Rome's great rival Carthage, and so that also figures into the importance of the Roman origin story. According to the Aeneid, Aeneas is a Trojan prince who has to flee from the city of Troy. When it falls to the Greeks, this is an event that takes place actually after the Iliad, it's not written into the Iliad. So while this myth connects Rome into that broader mythic Greek worldview of Homer, we may ask ourselves, we'll say, why are you picking yourself as being on the losing side? The Trojans lose this war after all. Do you want to say that Greeks can beat up on you? Well, I'll say that the origin gives the Romans an ancient lineage, and even in flight to exile, Aeneas is able to represent values the Romans saw in themselves, and so specifically filial piety. And so Aeneas is most frequently pictured carrying his aged father thrown over his back, while his father holds on to the household gods. So in other words, filial piety means he says his catchphrase is, I am pious Aeneas, sum pius Aeneas. And he therefore values his father. His father values the traditional gods, the Penates. And then he's got in his other hand his young son, Ascanius. So the patriarchal order is what's most important to Rome. Aeneas's wife is trailing along after. She actually doesn't make it. And that is also saying something about how the Romans understood themselves and the importance to them, I guess, familially of women. So modern academic disciplines, including history, linguistics, archaeology, genetics, they all confirm that the Romans are not Trojan exiles, which does not stop people today from pining to find a kernel behind that myth. So people would still like it to be true somehow, and they look for weird ways to connect it. And I'm just going to say that this is a modern fetish that we have for historicity. This fetish for historicity, I think, causes us to lose sight of the real purpose and value of an origin myth. It's not to tell real history, it's to explain to people identity and the meaning behind their identity. The Romans actually have a second, probably older and even more embarrassing origin myth. This is the story of Romulus and Remus, so twin brothers who were abandoned, raised by wolves, ultimately decide to found the city where they gather essentially brigands together, men who are free people but kind of thieves and who don't have a lot of women around as a result of that. And they end up attacking a neighboring tribe, the Sabines, in order to steal and indeed rape all of their women so that the Romans can have women in order to get their city going. And so I mentioned this as an example that your origin myth is not always written with with sort of a happy propaganda spin in mind. So there's sometimes a criterion of embarrassment that people have. Why would you make that up if they didn't do it? Well, there is some description again of how the Romans wanted to be seen in terms of their martial prowess at the very early stages when these stories were being told about themselves and about their relationship to their neighbors. And so that doesn't always include, like I say, these not embarrassing or highly moral stories that you might want to tell if you're making it up an origin story. So I mention that because sometimes that same criterion of embarrassment is cited to argue in favor of some historical kernel behind the Exodus myth. If it weren't historical, why would the Bible's authors make this up? Why would you want to say our origin is as former slaves who got away from the Egyptians? Like I say, in the Roman example, origin stories don't necessarily have to be rosy propaganda in order to make their point. As we've seen in many past lectures, the stories of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, were largely unknown and go unquoted in our earliest Israelite authors. So the earliest components of Isaiah, the historic prophet, is not telling stories about Adam and Eve. He's probably never heard that story. Likewise, we've seen that the text of the Pentateuch, the earliest that it might have been put together and known in the format that we have it, is during the Persian period, when we have the story that Ezra the scribe reads from the law for many days to the people, and the people are astounded because they are very unfamiliar with this text. This has not been a part of their life. This has not been a part of their practice. And it only becomes important, we saw a lecture recently, when did the Torah become authoritative? It only becomes absolutely critical to the identity during the later Hasmonean period, so right before the time period of Jesus' own day. So for Judeans who had been living in exile in Babylon under the Babylonians, and who had now returned to Jerusalem in order to rebuild, still as a subject people of the Persians, but on their own again in a way, this origin story where a great prophet and lawgiver leads his people out of bondage in Egypt and back to a promised land would have very special resonance. So I don't think we have to think very hard about why this story would resonate to the first audiences that heard it if it weren't actually having a historical kernel. The texts speak to the context of the authors when they're writing them. It's always the case. And so the texts of these books are all written millennia after their time setting. So if we are going to try to date these things like Bishop Ussher did, then, again, Eden is maybe 4,000, 5,000 years before the Common Era. The flood, 2,500 years before Abraham, 2,000 years before. So now this is getting us into the time period when Egypt is having an actual history, not a mythic history. And we can date the Egyptian Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, and you can see the time period then of the Hyksos, in between the Middle and New Kingdoms, in that intermediate period. And you can see also the time of Ramses in that New Kingdom period before the whole Bronze Age collapse, when all of Egypt's neighbors, including the Mycenaeans, including the Hittites, collapse. The Egyptians maintain themselves barely, but lose Canaan to the Sea Peoples. This is when maybe the Philistines emerge and are there. And then it's only then, centuries later, when we're getting to historic kings like Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah, kings of Judah after the fall of the northern kingdom, the more important kingdom, falls to the Assyrians. Hilkiah finding the Torah in the reign of King Josiah. Then almost right away thereafter, the fall of Jerusalem, the Babylonian captivity, the return of the exiles in Ezra. You can just see almost all those dots seem right next to each other when we contract the whole timeline in this way, so that we can see these time periods when these mythic stories are set. So in other words, there's no oral tradition that is maintaining this for thousands and thousands of years. These are unknown stories until we're getting down to when the actual historical time period is happening, when we're getting to the very end of the First Temple period, the captivity, and then the Second Temple period when the actual composition is taking place. Okay, so some have argued that the name Moses is part of an Egyptian theophoric name like Ramosa or Tutmosa, which means person born of Ra, the god Ra, born of Thoth. In other words, another Egyptian god. And so Mosa would be the end part of that, where the name of God is omitted. So it would be like Yamosa, Yahweh Mosa, something like that. Nevertheless, even if there was a historic Moses, the stories of the Torah are too late to preserve any historical details, and in any event, the texts are too late for him to have been the author. So I know we're talking about the documentary hypothesis and the supplementary hypothesis, but I want to start by just assuring everybody that there is no chance whatsoever for Mosaic authorship. That is not one of the options. So, if the 5 books of Moses could not have been written by Moses and were not written by Moses, who did write them? A close reading actually reveals that there are multiple voices in the text indicating multiple authors. And I keep saying the 5 books, we might as well list them off here while I have the writing here. So the 5 books are Genesis, which means origin, Exodus, which means the way out. Leviticus, which means of the Levites. The Levites are the priestly tribe. Numbers, which means numbers. Arithmoi is the Greek of that. And Deuteronomy, which means second law. And so then they also have the Hebrew names, which are based on the first words of each of the scrolls. So even in antiquity, it was observed that Deuteronomy doesn't quite fit the same chronological scheme that the other four books. So the other four books narrate a story from creation in Genesis 1 to the Israelites arriving at the east bank of the Jordan after wandering 40 years in the wilderness, where they are given kind of final instructions at the end of the book of Numbers, and they're ready to begin the conquest of Canaan in the later book of Joshua. And so that's already there at Numbers, and then there's another whole book, Deuteronomy, instead of it going straight to Joshua. So Deuteronomy then is set with Moses speaking to the people on the east bank of the Jordan, and he gives a big long discourse in which he goes back and talks again about all the wandering in the wilderness. He gives another whole set of instructions, which is where we get this name for the text. So Deuteronomy just means second law in Greek, so a second law, including a variant of the Ten Commandments. So that's repeated again. It's very similar to the version, but not quite the same as the version given in the book of Exodus, back in chapter 20 of the book of Exodus. So back in 1943, Martin Noth, a German biblical scholar, coined the term the Deuteronomistic histories in order to identify the books Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, as one kind of composite set, books that are from the same maybe school or editors, and that share a similar style and theological outlook. And he suggested that these share a lot in common stylistically and theologically with Deuteronomy, and also with the prophetic books of Jeremiah. And so the Jeremiah is associated also with the Deuteronomistic school. We have a story within those Deuteronomistic histories from the book of Kings, where one of the last kings of Judah towards the end of the first temple period, Josiah, who's been reigning since he was a very small child, now at the age of 26, orders that the Jerusalem temple has to be repaired, and that leads to finding a discovery. So we read in Kings that the high priest Hilkiah said to Shaphan, the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord." And when Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, he read it. Shaphan, the secretary, then informed the king, "The high priest Hilkiah has given me a book." Shaphan then read it aloud to the king. When the king heard the words of the book, he tore his clothes. So Josiah has this reaction because this book contains a bunch of commandments that he and everybody have never previously heard. So this is theoretically an ancient book, but in fact it's probably a book that has been written right around this time. So unlike the stories in Genesis and Exodus, which as we saw are set centuries, even millennia before the texts they were composed, this first draft of the book of Kings may actually date from the reign of Josiah or soon thereafter. And so this story of finding a book and then the religious reforms that Josiah has based on that are much more likely to have some historicity, some kind of historical background. And so as early as 1805, scholars suggested that the book Hilkiah found is the core part of the book of Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomic Law Code, which is understood as D1, or the oldest part of the present book as we have it. then other sections of Deuteronomy were added by later authors or editors, maybe during the exile period, to explain why the temple and the kingdom were destroyed, those kinds of additional explanations. But the earliest core part of the book, Deuteronomy, is perhaps dating to this reign of Josiah. So Deuteronomy has its own format and speaks with its own terminology and voice, while the other four books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, while they're more easily read together as a unit, internally they also include distinct voices that show clear signs of multiple authorship. So one voice in particular, in my opinion, stands out as being more formal and officious, and it tells long stories and especially long details about, let's say, priestly ceremonies and priestly garb and all this kind of thing that I find to be very boring. I think that this author tends to kind of make the Bible, boringifies the Bible the way Reverend Lovejoy, when he starts quoting long, repetitive nonsense. This author is filled with this kind of thing. So it's concerned with sacred rituals, sacred implements, and so forth. So we can see this voice, I think, in Numbers 20, toward the end of the wandering of the children of Israel in the wilderness, when they come to a place that's called Meribah. Now, there was no water for the community. I'm going to highlight a couple key words as I'm reading this. So there's no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community," I should have community there, bolded too, "into the wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting. So I want to highlight these words. So Moses and Aaron is always paired here with Moses. And we're talking about the community or the assembly a lot of times. So they fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so that they and their livestock can drink." So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." These were the waters of Meribah, and Meribah in Hebrew means quarreling. And so these are the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and where he was proved holy among them. So, as we're kind of reading all of this, you can just see the number of times that the text emphasizes the role of Aaron alongside Moses. You and your brother Aaron, Moses and Aaron. And then it also makes very frequent use of phrases like the tent of meeting, as opposed to the tabernacle, or however it would otherwise be presented, the assembly, and this community. So this particular voice, which we'll start to be calling P, uses this word or word like congregation more than 100 times, and other voices don't use it at all. This voice uses the phrase gathered to his people as a euphemism for death. So Abraham lived X amount of years and he was gathered to his people. That becomes a euphemism for death, and it's used 11 times in P texts, and no other voice in the Torah uses it. The P texts also use the phrase be fruitful and multiply 12 times. It's not used elsewhere. It's a central kind of commandment and theme of the P author. And the P is the only voice where it says that someone fell on his face when they are confronted with something shameful, and that happens 8 times in this voice. So in this story, at the very end, you sort of heard Moses and Aaron are denied entrance into the promised land for a seemingly small infraction, and I had to read it a couple times to even think of what they did that was different from what they were commanded. So they called the people rebels, and Moses strikes the stone twice with his staff instead of speaking to the rock and calling it forth and calling the water forth in the name of the Lord. So interestingly, this is not the only time, though, that we read about the waters of Meribah in the Torah, in the Pentateuch. So this story that we just read from the P voice is at the very end of the wandering, but there's a similar story found at the beginning of the 40 years in the wilderness that's told in Exodus 17. So the story in Exodus 17, like I say, occurs at towards the beginning of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So we read there, the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff which you struck the Nile, and go. And I will stand there before you by the rock." I will stand there, the Lord is saying, by the rock at Horeb. "Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So just already, as we're hearing this version of the Meribah story, there's no mention of Aaron. Instead of talking about going before the community or the assembly, the author is talking about going before the elders of Israel. And, it's sort of remarkable here that God is saying that God will actually stand there before him by the rock. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" So this is a doublet. We have essentially the same story duplicated in the Pentateuch. It occurs on the one hand at the beginning and also at the end of the wilderness journey. So the author of each version of this doublet tells the same story but uses different terminology, and they also have different interests. So as we kind of see, one really likes Aaron, and the other envisions God as being able to be present by a rock. So when we see these kinds of themes in the text, we identify stories where the same story is told twice, as it's a doublet. Sometimes the same story is even told 3 times, and that's a triplet. So sort of famously, as the triplets go in Genesis, there's the "she's my sister" stories. So in Genesis 12, we read, "There was famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to reside there. And it was when he was coming to Egypt, he said to his wife, Sarai, 'Here, I know you're a beautiful woman. And it will be when the Egyptians see you that they'll say, "This is his wife," and they'll kill me to keep you alive. Say you're my sister, so it will be good for me on your account, and I'll stay alive because of you.'" The Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful, and the woman was taken to the Pharaoh's house. And Yahweh plagued Pharaoh and his house, big plagues over the matter of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is it you've done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She's my sister'? So I took her for a wife myself." So that's one variant of the story. So in that variant, so Abram and Sarai elsewhere are related. They're half siblings because Sarai is they each share one parent anyway, and so there is an idea that it's not really a lie, but this is a way that Abram is shown to be clever, right? Nevertheless, we read in Genesis 20 a different version of the story. Abram traveled from there to the Negeb country and resided in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She's my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And God came to Abimelech in a night dream and said to him, "Here you're dead over a woman you took, for she's a man's wife." And Abimelech had not come close to her, and he said, "I did this in my heart's innocence and my hand's cleanness." And Abimelech called Abraham to him and said, "What have you done to us, and how did I sin against you, that you brought a big sin over me and my kingdom?" And Abraham said, "Because I said, 'There just isn't fear of God in this place, and they'll kill me on account of my wife.' And also, she is in fact my sister, my father's daughter, but not my mother's daughter, and so she became a wife to me." So that explains the actual relationship. But there's another version again of this story, and it doesn't now involve Abram and Sarah, but instead it's Isaac and his wife Rebekah, but it again involves Abimelech. So there was a great famine in the land, and Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, at Gerar. And Yahweh appeared to Isaac and said, "Don't go down to Egypt." And so Isaac lived at Gerar. And the people of the place asked about his wife, and he said, "She's my sister," because he was afraid to say my wife, or else the people of the place will kill me for Rebekah because she's good looking. And Abimelech, king of the Philistines, gazed through the window and looked out of a window and saw Isaac fondling his wife Rebekah. And Abimelech called Isaac and said, "But here, you said, here, she's your wife. How could you say she's my sister? What is this you've done to us? One of the people nearly could have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us." So it's clear that we've got more or less three versions of the same story. We might have had this be just the modus operandi of Abraham every time he goes and visits somebody, but then we see the story repeated again with the next generation. So it's simply such a good story that it continues to be told, even though it ends up as a triplet within Genesis. So in the first case, Abram and Sarai go to Egypt. Pharaoh actually lies with Sarai, and that causes God to curse Egypt. In the second one, it's Abraham and Sarah at Gerar. Abimelech takes Sarah to his bed, but God prevents him from coming closer to her and nevertheless curses Gerar. And then finally, with Isaac and Rebekah at Gerar, Abimelech is worried that God would have cursed them had somebody accidentally taken Rebekah as a wife. So there's the one story that's the harshest, but in any event, in the triplets, they become less, the same possible caution, but less stark. So the two creation stories at the beginning of Genesis are among the most famous examples of the Pentateuch's multiple voices. So the first story is found in Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 2:3. And this story has a cosmic God creating heavens and earth over a period of 7 days. So it's very rhythmic. At the end of each period, it says the evening and the morning were the first day. God saw all that he created, it was good. The evening and the morning were the second day, and so forth. The second creation story is found in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 through chapter 3, verse 24. And it has a much less cosmic, a lot more fleshy God who creates the Adam, the man, by blowing into his nostrils, and he creates Eve by reshaping one of the man's ribs and places them in the famous Eden story. So in Genesis 1, the first creation story, like I say, we see a cosmic God overseeing creation. It's a very famous quotation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light was good, and he separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. So the days go on. We get to the fourth day, and God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let the lights in the vault of the sky be lights in the vault of the sky to give their light on the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He made also the stars, and God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. So this is a cosmic creator that is creating a cosmos that is based on the contemporary Middle Eastern worldview with a dome, a hemispheric dome over a flat earth, in which in the dome of the sky all of the different stars and planets and the great light and the lesser light, the sun and the moon, are all there. And they're there so that we can mark out the calendar and all those cosmic things. All of this story culminates when God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God created he them. Male and female, he created them. So after creating humankind, male and female, in God's image, God rests on the seventh day, and that becomes the basis for Sabbath observance in the version of the Ten Commandments that is found in the 20th chapter of Exodus, but not the version that is found of the Ten Commandments that's found in Deuteronomy chapter 5, which instead has the Sabbath observance as a commemoration for the Exodus from Egypt. So after that first creation story, the P one, as we'll start to call it, we have a new creation story beginning in Genesis 2:4, the J story. And so it starts with almost like a beginning of a story again. This is the account of the heavens and earth when they were created. So it's starting over again. When the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up. For the Lord God had not yet sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. So we'd already had all these plants and things being created in the first chapter, and now we're hearing again that there aren't any. This is a new story. Likewise, then God, the Lord God, formed a man from the dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man that he had formed. And the Lord God said, "It's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable to him." Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky. He brought them to the man to see what the man would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds in the sky, and all the wild animals. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found, so the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. So I think actually after we just read those two, there is a very strong distinction between these two creation stories. The portrayal of God, the kind of thing that God is doing. Certainly the order of creation in the first story, the order is plants, then animals, then humans, male and female together, whereas in the second story, the order is first man, then plants, then animals, and then finally the woman. So in addition to breathing into the nostrils and taking a rib, God in the Eden story wanders around the garden, looks for Adam and Eve, doesn't immediately see where they are. God makes garments for them. He interacts with the man and the woman very directly, in the same way that we saw God standing before Moses at the rock at Meribah in this voice, or in a similar voice. So the voice associated with the Eden story can be identified in snippets in the Pentateuch, all the way from Genesis through Numbers, just like the officious voice of the cosmic creation story is easily identified. So these are what we're calling P and J. So the author of the Eden story, J, loves to make puns, loves irony, loves humor and scandal, and has no interest in all of these priestly rituals or how many cubits to make a certain vessel or anything like that. So there's at least two very recognizable voices that everybody can see in this text, even in translation. So that means thus far, we've identified a minimum of 3 or 4 authors. So we have the author of Deuteronomy. We have the officious cosmic author who cares a lot about Aaron and priestly rituals, P, we've been calling the priestly source. And we have the author of the Eden story who envisions Yahweh as a more fleshy, hands-on kind of God than the cosmic God of the P source. And so we call this the J author, or the Yahweh source. And in addition to that, we have another set, which is other. So sometimes we quote poems or other components that are thought to be older pre-biblical texts that have been inserted in by one of the authors. So in other words, it's an earlier book, so that would be another author or another voice. And sometimes a later editor is changing things, like the later voice in Deuteronomy. And so there are those other voices as well, in addition to these 3 major ones that we've identified. So each of these, as we mentioned, have their own viewpoints and also their own unique terminology. And so the J source, the Yahwist, is the one that uses to know in the biblical sense, so a euphemism for sex. So he knew his wife and she conceived and bare. That occurs 5 times in the Pentateuch. All of them are in J sections. The term Sheol for hell, the place of the dead, not really hell, but anyway, the underworld, the resting place of the dead, occurs 6 times in the J source, and it's not mentioned in the other voices. The word to suffer occurs 7 times in the Pentateuch, all in J sections. So there are unique terms that are there in the same way we identified a bunch of unique terms that are in the P source only. So in other words, there's complete agreement that the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, could not have been and were not written by Moses. Similarly, though, there's agreement that alongside other voices, those pre-biblical texts and later editors, there's at least 3 distinct voices that can be identified in the Torah as we now have it. So really, that's all agreed. The question, though, remains, how did we get them in the present form? How did they take place in their present form? So there's 2 basic possibilities for these multiple authorship texts in antiquity to happen, and they happen all the time. They're both very common. So when we've done our lecture on the book of Job, we see that sometimes the way this works is there's an original core text that keeps getting expanded by subsequent authors who keep adding their own little parts to it. And so if we look at how the book of Job probably got into its present form, there was probably an original core book that was written, took the form of a poem, and it consisted of what is now chapters 3 all the way through chapters 31, which start and end with a monologue by Job, and then in the middle time have 3 cycles of Job arguing with his 3 friends. And so essentially they are questioning the problem of evil, and they are trying to, Job is trying to make the case, and he successfully does make the case, that even though he is blameless, he has been made to suffer, and so therefore the righteous do suffer, and the wicked are allowed to get away with it. The wicked are allowed to prosper in this world, despite what you might read in prudential wisdom books like the book of Proverbs. And Job's 3 friends each are suggesting that no, you must have done something wrong, because that's what prudential wisdom teaches us. And so Job says, no, that's not how it works. I don't necessarily have an answer for you, but what I can say is that that God has denied me justice. And so it is a powerful complaint, and it was a disturbing book to people. So next author got a hold of it and thought, well, wait a second, I've got an answer to the problem of evil. And so a second author, dissatisfied with the original text pessimism, has a 4th friend, introduces a 4th friend that hadn't been around at all. And this guy, Elihu, who gives an answer. He says, look, Job, God's plans are too big. God is too, we can't understand why God is doing those things. It may seem like you are suffering for no good reason, but God has a good reason, you just don't know it. And the problem with that is that Job has already responded to that argument in the original poem, but the person who wants that to be the solution still tacks this on to try to have an answer to the problem of evil. Didn't do a great job of it, and so a later author uses the same argument but creates a much more impressive employment of that argument by adding one of the most famous speeches out of the Bible, God speaking to Job from the whirlwind. We've said before, this is probably tacked on after the Elihu speeches, because if these speeches were there, nobody would add in the Elihu speeches. They're not good enough if you already have the same argument being made by God in a much more successful way, neither of which, though, really address what Job has said. He's already addressed that he's aware of this argument. At some point or other, someone tacked in a completely unrelated poem to wisdom, so people who were sages would pen poems in praise of wisdom, and so this simply got inserted into the text. And then finally, a prose prologue and a prose epilogue were added to the text as a framing device to reframe it. And so this is the text that kind of famously makes the whole experience of Job sort of a wager between God and the Satan, God and the accuser, about whether Job is righteous simply because God has blessed him, or whether he would be righteous regardless. And so that sort of changes the whole tone of the thing by adding that. So you can kind of see this is a text that expanded, has multiple authors, and it expanded in with discrete seams into a different text, a larger text, the way we have it now. So expansion is one way to do it. Another hypothetical expansion that is sort of like this may be how the Gospel of John was created. So hypothetically or theoretically, there might have been an older kernel, a smaller text called the Signs Gospel, which also might have been either just the Signs Gospel or the Signs Gospel and an early Passions Gospel that was telling the Easter story, which might account for the overlap of Passion details between the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospels, which otherwise are not too similar to each other, but share these sort of Passion details. So it may not be the case, it may be or may not be. The hypothetical idea of it here, though, is that if it is the case that there was this source, it wasn't simply that the next author takes that and puts it in the middle and then adds something to the beginning and the end. Instead, they have taken that and just taken a snippet of it and then written their own expansion and then taken the next snippet and written their own expansion. And so it makes it appear like the original text has been spliced up and deposited within the newly expanded text. In fact, what happens is you're writing some of the text yourself, then you quote a couple lines from this original source, then you write more of your own, then you quote another couple lines, and so on. So that's how an expansion can happen, where the original text is distributed in little pieces throughout a text. And then after that major writer, the most significant writer of the Gospel of John, has done that and written the bulk of the text, then what we can say is there is for sure a second John author. Neither of these guys are named John, but there's another editor who takes the first major author of John's work, adds a new ending to it, and also seems to have made some, I would say, hackneyed edits throughout. So I'm not as a big fan of John 2, who was a much less sophisticated thinker than John 1. But in any event, this would be a way where you can see that this text is expanded, where there was one text, then another text, then another text. It's expanded, but it's not easily discernible seams. The texts are distributed throughout the whole, right? But alternatively, there is another way that this can happen. You could actually start with discrete texts that are completely distinct from one another. So, and then bring those together. So, for example, the author of the Gospel of Matthew, when he is going to write his book, he most likely is not simply expanding an earlier book. He's not just simply taking the Gospel of Mark and writing his own expansion to it. He's taking multiple pre-existing sources. So Mark, the Lost Sayings source, the Lost Sayings Gospel Q, and then really his own Matthean materials, which may have been a text that existed only within the Matthean community, that has a bunch of parables that don't otherwise exist in any other sources, and takes those three and combines three books that were not meant to be, that didn't know each other, and combines them together into one story. So in other words, it's not just the expansion where you take a core text, you know it, you add to it, you take that and then add to it, you take that and then add to it, that kind of expansion. This is a composite, right? A combination of different texts that are distinct. So all three of these sources are intermixed and combined in order to create the composite Gospel of Matthew, which again takes snippets from each one. So he'll take something from Mark, and then he'll take something from Q, and then he'll take some Matthean stuff, he'll write some of his own little edits, and then he'll go back and forth taking source materials. And so as a result, it makes it look like the texts have been spliced and recombined together. You know, you're writing and you're just consulting each one as you go. So, although the previous scholarly consensus concerning the creation of the Pentateuch has broken down, so for a better part of a century, people really thought the documentary hypothesis was how this would have been created. Scholars still largely accept that there's going to be one of two possibly large broad paths, the two that I just described. So either there was an initial source text that has been expanded and then expanded, and that's the supplementary hypothesis, or there were distinct sources that got combined together by a redactor or editor or a series of redactors or editors. And so the documentary hypothesis. Those are the two broad ways to describe how do we get to a set of books that have distinct voices within them that are discernible. So like I said, we did a couple previous lectures on the documentary hypothesis, and they've been, both of them, very popular, so they each have 300,000 or 400,000 views. But we gave them a while ago, and I haven't, I've actually read a lot more about the supplementary hypothesis and since that time, and so I wanted to make this additional case. We got asked about this a couple weeks ago too in the questions. So as we're looking at the different voices in the Torah, it is not like the book of Job where we have these very simple themes. It is more like what we're going to see with the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Matthew, where the voices are continuously interspersed. So whether the Torah, the Pentateuch, is a combination of books that were originally distinct, like in Matthew, or whether there was a single original source that has undergone repeated expansion, like John, the voices are very complicated and interlaced. It's not just that they are simple themes like in Job that would make it easier to work with. So sometimes in the composite text, the way we have it in the Pentateuch, two voices covering the same material, the same general material, like the creation stories, they're placed back to back, and we just read those. So the creation story that exists from the priestly source, comes first, and then we have it start all over again, and we have the creation story from the J source, from the Yahweh source. Other times, like that Meribah story, where Moses strikes the rock, or the She's My Sister stories, there are doublets or triplets that are simply repeated at different points in the composite, so they're not all back to back, but they just placed at different parts of the narrative as if it's a different story entirely. So it's like the Israelites go to Meribah twice and have almost exactly the same thing happen. However, in many other places, the different voices are directly interspliced within the same telling of the same story. And this happens, for example, in the story of Noah's Ark. So I want to look at that in a little more detail. So rather than existing one right after the other, or making it so that there's two floods, the two voices that are telling Noah stories are interspliced or interspersed. So these are, again, the J and P versions. So in the J story, we read, or in the J voice, we read, "The Lord saw," this is in Genesis 6, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." So having had that setup, then the next few verses later, we have another setup. "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on the earth had corrupted their ways. God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make for yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around." And there's a lot of other details. So the P source likes to tell you how many cubits everything's going to be, and all of these kinds of detailed instructions that God gives, like for Solomon's temple and other things. So you are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, 2 of every kind of animal, 2 of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. So in the priestly version of this, God orders just 2 of every creature. But a few verses later, God in the J story gives a different set of orders and numbers for animals to be preserved. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive through the earth." So the regular unclean animals are just a pair, but in this case now, when we're having clean animals, in other words, the kind that can be either eaten or used for animal sacrifices especially, now Noah is to bring 7 pairs. So like I say, Noah needs 7 pairs of clean animals in the J story in order to offer sacrifices. So at the very end of the Noah's Ark story, you maybe remember, the ark makes it back to dry land, Mount Ararat, and Noah offers a sacrifice of a couple of these animals that have been saved. You may wonder, well, if you only brought 2 of every kind, what happens when who you sacrifice? You sacrifice in the unicorn or something. That's why we don't have those. but in fact, because in the J story, the story that includes the sacrifices, he's brought 7 pairs. The reason why the priestly author only had God order 2 pairs is that the priestly author, who considers himself to be a descendant of Aaron, and that's why in all the Moses stories, he's always talking about Moses and Aaron. Aaron is the first high priest in the priestly account. Aaron is the first person who is authorized to perform sacrifices according to the law of Moses, and only Aaron's descendants can ever offer sacrifices. So Noah does not offer a sacrifice in the priestly account because Noah's not a priest because he's not a descendant of Aaron. And so Abraham, none of these pre-Aaronic figures are allowed to sacrifice in the priestly story. So it's showing the different editorial interests of each of these authors. So in P, going back to that same cosmic creation, God opens the gates of the heavenly firmament, over which the cosmic waters are, established in the Genesis 1p creation story, and that causes the flood to destroy the whole earth. So we read, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, on that day, all of the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. By contrast, J, as is usual, has a much more personal, fleshy God who personally shuts the ark's door himself. So we read, Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Then the Lord shut him in. For 40 days the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. Then, as it concludes in the P story, Noah sends out a raven that does not come back, while in the J story, Noah sends repeatedly out doves, and eventually one comes back with an olive leaf that is giving the symbol. We now use it as a symbol of peace, the dove and an olive leaf, but it's the symbol that land is possible again, that the waters have receded. So in short, in stories like Noah, J and P are completely intertwined. And so again, we have to ask, how did they end up this way? So there's an option, maybe J was written first, and then a P author was just reading a little bit of J, then writing their part, and so on. Or it's possible that they are 2 completely different texts that a redactor has put together. So the easiest possible explanation is the supplementary hypothesis. So this recognizes, I think as everybody kind of recognizes, that the oldest section is Deuteronomy. The oldest section of Deuteronomy is the original component of the Torah. And so this is that book that we said was found by the priest Hilkiah in the time of Josiah, so at the very end of the first temple period. So to that core text, the J author, the Yahwist author, then adds all of the J narratives. So all of those kind of, the fleshy idea of God and all of those kind of ironic and sometimes scandalous stories with all the puns. And that happens, and then finally the priestly author adds the bulk of the rest of the text, and that results in the Pentateuch as we have it. So this is the least number of steps necessary. It's a much more simple expansion story, like we talked about with the hypothetical Gospel of John, or how Job was expanded, as opposed to the way Matthew is composing a gospel using distinct books that don't know each other, or are not written one after the other. So, like I say, most versions of, if we look at each of those voices, most versions of both the supplementary and documentary hypotheses have largely a similar view about D1 anyway, the book that is found by Hilkiah in Josiah's day, so the law code of Deuteronomy. So D, Deuteronomy, is a priestly law code that is really focused on monolatry, but it doesn't emphasize Aaron. It's not about the Zadokite priesthood line. It's not about the priestly family that controls the temple in Jerusalem. It has priestly interests, but it's a different priestly line. And so it may be linked with priests like Jeremiah, who we also have mentioned is connected to the Deuteronomic school. So Jeremiah is a priest who is also very active at this time, at the very end of the first temple period. And so maybe his school is where this D source is coming from. So maybe that's the origin of this. It is the origin according to the supplementary hypothesis. So if there's multiple ways that you can create a supplementary hypothesis, but most of the scholars who favor a supplementary hypothesis then propose that the J author expanded on the D text writing during the Babylonian exile. So after the first and before the second temple period, this period of the exile, the writer of J seems to be a courtly author, so certainly lacks all the interests of priests. We mentioned, they like puns, they like satirical stories that are a little bit scandalous, stories that are more, we might think, entertaining. And so they are possibly writing for the Davidic princes, the exiled royal family of Judah, and all of the other noble exiles in Babylon, so people that are at the court of the king of Babylon. And so we'll just note that in the supplementary hypothesis, there is not a separate Elohist or E source. We haven't talked about that yet, but I will. Essentially, they understand the J source as being J plus E. There's just the one source that is expanding, and it would include all the things that other scholars have identified as E. So in the exile, perhaps that's when J expands on the Deuteronomic core. Finally, then after the exile, in the Persian period, when priests like Ezra and priests who do consider themselves to be descendants from Aaron, the Zadokites, the Sadducees, when they go back to Jerusalem to rebuild, the idea is that D plus J text, that core, was then expanded pretty massively by the priestly author who has all of those interests of the priests, including especially promoting Aaron. So when that's happening, that round could have been when other, let's say, old snippets of text out of the archive could also have been put in there, like like the Song of Moses or something that's an older text that makes its way into it. That's not one of the major voices. So, like I say, what are the advantages? So, simplicity is really the clear advantage of the supplementary hypothesis. So, we're really only having, a root source that's expanded a couple times in order to get us to the Pentateuch. It doesn't require an additional voice, the hypothetical E or Elohist voice. And that has always been a problem with the documentary hypothesis because E and J are kind of similar and they're difficult to differentiate. And so in this theory, they are not different. They are the same. And so it is, Occam's razor. We've sliced off one more thing than we need to explain things. It is also much simpler to explain a process of expansion like we see with Job or with the Gospel of John, rather than positing the complex amalgam where you take distinct sources that have to be combined by redactors. But again, like I say, that's not impossible to imagine because it does seem that Gospels like Matthew and Luke are created that way, and other ancient texts as well. So if you like Occam's razor, this is why this one is for you. It's certainly by far the simpler one, and it requires less hypothetical ideas and steps. But in contrast to the way maybe physical and hard sciences work, what actually turns out is that humans are very, very complicated, and that is often true with history. So a lot of times the simplest explanation of why something might have happened in history may not be the case because there might have been a weird, long, complicated set of things that led to it. And so the documentary hypothesis is clearly much more complicated than a supplementary hypothesis. So why do I think that there are still cases to be made? So the additional complexity has, I think, some additional argumentative benefit. So, for example, J and E, or if J is just one, J, tends to really denigrate Aaron. So, for example, when Moses goes away to receive the Ten Commandments, and the people all rebel into revelry and immediately fall into idolatry, Aaron just steps right up and creates the golden calf idol for them. This would have been just completely just something that the people in the priestly, the high priest would not have want that. They don't want to have a story about your ancestor, your great ancestor, this hero that you've done all of this work of trying to have, every time Moses is mentioned, you write, Moses and Aaron are doing these things before the tent of meeting and the congregation of the people. And now you have this story where Aaron is the ultimate apostate. This is not something that you want. So like I say, P is focused on idolizing Aaron. And I think for me, it's fairly difficult to believe that if that text existed there with Aaron having that heresy, it's difficult to imagine that the P author simply leaves that there and simply expands the text without crossing that part out at least and replacing it. And so I think that the supplementary hypothesis, the idea that the priestly author is simply supplementing the text that went before, underestimates the incredible hostility that the priestly author has to the J author. And so I think the priestly author's goal, rather than supplement, is to replace. So we already have an example of this, in my view, in the Second Temple period, where we took that Deuteronomistic history, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and a scribe, using those as his source, attempts to rewrite them by fixing them theologically, by eliminating and changing very embarrassing stories in order to create the very sanitized version that exists in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And I think that the goal of the chronicler was to get rid of the others. In other words, this was not widely circulated as a text. And this often works if you, in antiquity, if you have a bigger text, you can make a streamlined, easier to circulate, cleaner version, and yours will supplant and get rid of the older version. So I think the chronicler was ultimately trying to eliminate the Deuteronomistic histories. And I think that the P author was prefer to replace the J text rather than simply add to it. And so if it's simply supplementing, they're trying to add to it. And I think in this particular case with the chronicler, it's simply just ironic to the chronicler's agenda that ultimately they all get put together in the Bible, and Chronicles just comes right after Kings, and you have this contradictory, apologetic, cleaned up version of the better stories and older stories right next to them. So there's also an argument, I think, for the Elohist voice, or saying that there is an Elohist voice. So it has been difficult, yes, to delineate this for scholars because both seem to be pretty old and have a lot of similarities. There are still some indications that a separate voice is there. So for example, when the Israelites go to the mountain of God, the P source always calls that mountain Sinai, while the D source calls it Mount Horeb. Similarly, the priestly source calls Moses' father-in-law Ruel, while the Deuteronomy source calls him Jethro. So if there's no E, if J and E are the same, then what we'll find out is that J and E use both of those names indiscriminately. So sometimes it will call the mountain Sinai, and other times it will call it Horeb, sometimes it will call the father-in-law Jethro, and other times Reuel. However, if it is a separate voice, then that would solve the inconsistency. So if there's J that is distinct from E, then J, in this particular case anyway, shares the terminology found in the priestly source, calling the names, using the names Sinai and Reuel, whereas E and D are aligned in always saying Mount Horeb and Jethro for Moses' father-in-law. And there's similar terminology issues like that. So E also seems to have a distinct perspective. So when you separate out E stories, E seems especially interested in this period, when you think of the division between the larger and more important northern kingdom of Israel and the smaller, less important kingdom of Judah, E is especially interested in the heroes and places of the northern kingdom. So in one of the E stories in Genesis, Israel, Jacob acquires the territory of Shechem, the northern capital, by purchasing it. Whereas in the Yahweh story, it is gotten by violence, and it's more or less desecrated. In the E source, the north is identified as the burial place for Joseph, one of the patriarch who is in charge of who's the father of Ephraim and Manasseh, the two central northern tribes. The E source focuses on Joseph a lot as a hero. He is also critical of the house of David, the Davidic kings, the southern royal family. In addition to spending a lot of time with Jacob and especially Joseph, he also elevates the Ephraimite hero Joshua. So lots of northern focus. By contrast, the J author has interests in the southern kingdom, in Judah, its places and heroes. So there's an emphasis of Abraham living in Hebron, which is the original capital of Judah before David establishes Jerusalem as the capital. Likewise, in J, the scouts that Moses sends out only report on locations in Judah, and the sole scout named is Caleb, who's a Judahite, as opposed to Joshua, who is a northern hero. And only J has long stories about the biblical patriarch Judah, the brother of Joseph. So there does seem to be reasons to assert that there's maybe a distinction between a J and an E source. Finally, I still find the original case for why we even call these sources J and E to be pretty compelling, which is, in that same way that I was talking about how the priestly author, who is so interested in Aaron and being a priest, that he has to not have Adam, not have Noah, not have Abraham or any of the patriarchs ever offer a sacrifice, because the first person that can offer sacrifice is Aaron, and after that it is only allowed for Aaron and his descendants. In that same way, the reason we call the J source J is for Jehovah, because in E and P, God does not reveal God's name until Moses is standing before the burning bush. And Moses, one of the things that Moses says is, if I'm going to go to Egypt, they're going to ask, what is your name? And so then for the very first time, God reveals God's name, Yahweh, I am that I am, to Moses at the burning bush. And so that's when, before it, they've always used euphemism like El for God or the Lord, not the name, not the Lord, but El. So in other words, the word euphemism God as opposed to Yahweh. And then afterwards, P and E start using the name of Yahweh, which has now been revealed. By contrast, right from the very beginning, like we saw in the Eden story, the Yahwist author simply refers to God as Yahweh. So he's not caring about Moses, is not caring about that big reveal. And so, if there's no E, if J and E are the same author, then the J author is simply using the name of God, indiscriminately without that. That whole idea that a reveal happens at the burning bush doesn't make any sense, and we just discard it. And it can be discarded. Again, I think Occam's razor takes it away in that, but I think it is still a compelling case, and one of the reasons why I think that there's a lot of sense to the documentary hypothesis, even if there's more complexity. That said, sometimes people who are arguing against the documentary hypothesis go back to the very first scholars who formulated it over a century ago, who speculated that the J source and the E source were really ancient. In other words, that they may have been written before the fall of the northern kingdom to the Assyrians. And so that's not necessary for this hypothesis. And indeed, I would say that that's not the case. I would rather think that the J source, the E source, and the original Deuteronomist source are all written at the very end, maybe, of the First Temple period, where the J source is a courtier in the Jerusalem court, who is telling again these sort of sly stories for entertaining the nobles and the Judahite kings. The E source is doing something similar at the court, but is actually an exile from the northern kingdom, so someone who has been part of the kingdom of Israel, or whose ancestors were, and who is now at the Judahite court sharing their stories. And then the priests from the Deuteronomic school are producing that core law code of Deuteronomy at that time. And so to some extent or other, J and E are combined together to tell one story by a redactor, according to the documentary hypothesis. And that is maybe the people are aware of the Deuteronomic source or not. Maybe those two are aware of each other. But the priestly author is aware of those, but rather than trying to supplement them, is attempting to replace them by writing a counter J.E. Torah, but creates a distinct and a distinctly hostile text to J.E. And then all of these texts are floating around in the Second Temple period, in the Persian period, and they have started to become thought of as being important source text for identity. And so the final redactor tries to delete as little of it as possible, tries to include as many of the stories together as possible, even though in some cases we get repetitive doublets, even though you have to splice and put together stories right next to each other, like the Noah story, where the details therefore don't match. And they do, generally speaking, a pretty amazing job. But this is why you can have voices that I think pretty much hate each other right next to each other in almost the same kind of, paragraph by paragraph. It's completely possible to do that when you're supplementing, but I just feel like the temptation would be to start striking out the stuff you especially don't like if you were the priestly author. So this is why why I'm still leaning towards the documentary hypothesis, but hopefully I've also been fair in spelling out a supplementary hypothesis, which, like I said, is certainly the easier or simpler model, less hypothetically, requires less hypotheticals, and is more in keeping with Occam's razor than this more complicated diagram. So with that, we will go ahead and conclude. I'll take another glass of water, and hopefully I won't be coughing as much. Appreciate you guys sticking with me through that. Leandro will get your questions and comments. Boy, I want to thank some of our recent contributors on PayPal and other platforms: Galen DaCosta, Alexander McCaffrey, the American Legacy Construction, Jason Bishop, Ken Freeland, Jolly Green, Ron Wagner, Charles Reynolds, Kendall Morris, Virginia Ortega, William Gesely, John Klinkner, Ariel Umberto, Tierra Molina, Jules Luce, Kelly Higgins, Reagan Harrington, Jennifer Hickson, Eric Nordquist, and I also want to thank those of you who are supporting the channel in the live chat right now. So JM, Mr. Randy Thor, Darther Rama, Ron Wagner again, James Ferguson, Dave Anderson, and Dan Howard. So James Sweeney also, thank you for your support. James asks, have you thought about creating a chart showing where each Old Testament book is written versus what time period they are claiming to be about? That's a great idea. Yeah, so essentially it's like the book is set here, and then the setting of the book is here, but it's actually written here. And so I've done that, for example, when we were talking about the historical Jesus and the text we have about Jesus compared to, let's say, the historical Buddha and the text we have about Buddha. And so the historical Muhammad, the text we have about him. In other words, the distance in time between the figure, like Zoroaster, and then the text that we have about them. But I could also do it for these books, and I think that would be useful as well. Because again, we should always note, the context of a book, its historical context is the context of the author, because the ancient author really only knows about what's going on in their contemporary times, and it does not actually reflect the time period that they're setting their story in, because it will be filled with anachronisms, and it's not going to have that kind of historical insight. Cliff Fornwalt, thanks for your support. Cliff asks, I grew up evangelical, but realized very young the unreality of much of it. I became an atheist, but I worry I and my children are missing lessons and wisdom contained in millennia of tradition and thinking. Your approach helps me restore that. Well, Cliff, I'm so thankful that has been the case. We have a fairly similar background in that way. I grew up in a fundamentalist religion, so I grew up in the LDS Church, the Mormon Church. I read, the different texts, like the Book of Mormon, as a teenager, and some of the other Mormon scriptures, and I said, there's no way that this is a history book, that this can't have happened. And I was able to deconstruct those we didn't have the internet, we didn't have all of the kind of text you could read about it. I was able to do that based on what I knew about Egyptian history for the Book of Abraham, and the history of North America and the indigenous peoples and so on. And so I deconstructed that for myself. I went off and studied history. And I was not involved in any religion at all for the bulk of the center part of my adult life. I left when I was 18, and it's only when I was 30 that I encountered the church I'm now a member of, and I started learning about it. And at first I was like, could a church really be like the way the people are claiming it is, and not be fundamentalistic, not requiring that you have all of this creed, that you believe in, things that obviously didn't happen. And so having a church that is able to be an open forum for this kind of exploration, for millennia of tradition, our inheritance, for finding meaning, has become really important for me. And I'm very happy if that's also been helpful for you, and if it's helpful for your children as well. That's wonderful. Winston Barquez says, is it not that the oral traditions of the J writer were the oldest source, although D was the first to be written down as a coherent narrative? So that's possible. I'm not sure that that's the way that it would be described by the supplementary hypothesis. So it's hard to say exactly how much oral tradition is underwriting the J writer, because again, we don't have a lot of evidence for stories like Adam and Eve that they're known by the earliest writers. So if this is a famous story in oral tradition prior to when it's actually getting written down, we don't have a lot of or any evidence of that. And so it's possible that that's the case, and so J is often thought of as being perhaps the oldest one of the writers, and certainly I think several of the people who favor the documentary hypothesis, like Harold Bloom, really like the Yahwist writer maybe the most. I like the E writer too, and so I think that we shouldn't discount how potentially old that one is too. So I sort of see J, E, and the original D writer as possibly all having a lot of antiquity, and it's hard to exactly say when each, other than the Deuteronomist, when the other two were written. Nathan Gale, one of my favorite lectures is when you considered whether the Yahwist author was a woman. How does the supplementary hypothesis respond to this idea? I guess it's still possible. So we had a lecture where we talked about this idea, where the interesting thing is that the Yahwist author has a lot of very powerful women in the narrative, and so there's a lot of unexpectedly smart and matriarchs that are getting the better of their patriarchs. So at a certain point, Isaac is sort of a doddering old blind guy, and his wife Rebecca is able to get her favorite son to have his blessing, and no blessing that's worth anything is left for Isaac's favorite son, Esau. And that's just one of many, many examples. And so those same stories would exist in the J text in a supplementary hypothesis. And so it would just be a later era. And so now, instead of it being somebody who potentially is a Judahite princess at the court of Josiah or something like that in the Iron Age kingdom of Judah before its fall, instead we would be talking about a Judahite princess in exile in Babylon, or a noble woman in exile in Babylon. Or again, one of the options that could always be the case, we said this also for the authorship of the Gospel of Luke, maybe there is an important princess in exile or before the exile who is like stories like this, and who is patronizing an author who is writing something that she is interested in, including stories that she likes. Seeking Something says, isn't Moses' use of a staff reminiscent of the Bacchants in the woods using their staff to draw out wine, honey, and milk from rocks? Why are sticks making wine? Well, so there are I think that there is a long tradition, of this idea of, of a staff that is the implement of let's say the magic maker, the person that is doing a miracle, the person that is doing magic. So even in the Exodus story as we have it, it's not just Moses that has a staff that he can throw down on the ground and turn into a snake. All of the magicians of Pharaoh have staffs that they can use to do the same thing. We have, even as late as like the earliest depictions we have of Jesus follow in this same kind of playing on him as a wonder worker doing miracles. And so in the earliest kind of Roman depictions, he's sort of dressed as a sage or a philosopher with a staff that he uses to indicate that he's going to perform the miracles, because again, staff is a symbol of that. And that continues in iconography all the way to the present. So we think of Gandalf having his staff, or fighting Saruman who has a staff. So wizards have staffs. And that has just been part of the iconography going back into prehistory. April Van Ryn says, would it be fair to say the intention of the author of the book of Job originally was to show God's power, and over time it became interpreted differently? What do you think the original intention was, and have people interpreted it differently over time? I think we've had a lecture recently, April, where I was talking about the development of the Hebrew wisdom tradition, and it gets started, and it's a separate tradition actually from the priestly tradition of people who are priests who are focused on law and Torah, and it's different from the prophetic tradition of people like the followers of Isaiah who are quoting poetry where God is speaking directly to the people and telling them to change. The wisdom source is its own thing, and the sages begin with compilations like the book of Proverbs, which is telling you, good common sense wisdom, penny saved is a penny earned kind of thing, like Benjamin Franklin will talk about. But one of the things that happens is that in that kind of prudential, how do you be prudent in order to be successful, that kind of wisdom, Proverbs ends up making a bunch of promises. It promises you, if you do X, Y, and Z, you'll be healthy, wealthy, and wise. But people over time realize that, no, you can do everything right. You can take all the right steps, and there's still, a chance that you're going to get cancer. Something's going to happen. So at a certain point, the wisdom writers had a little bit of that kind of a crisis of faith in wisdom, where they say, yes, it is on the whole wise to follow these steps, and you'll most likely get the best result. But sometimes that doesn't happen. And so this becomes the reflective stage of the wisdom tradition, and the core book, the original book of Job, is part of that reflective wisdom, as is the book of Ecclesiastes. And so I think that the core of it is that you can be blameless and you could still suffer. Some of people who in the world are suffering to no fault of their own. And so how do we cope with that? I think that's the core original intent of the book of Job. And then once we've had that, it brings up the problem of evil. And so people have interpreted Job very differently over time, including the different authors who added to it, who try to give their own answers for the problem of evil. Like I say, one of the major answers that gets tacked on is the idea, you think, you're suffering, sure, the Holocaust was terrible, but God has a really big plan, and if he hadn't allowed the Holocaust to happen, something really terrible would happen. Well, it becomes a little hollow, when you're saying, how bad was it going to be when you have to think of the Holocaust, Maybe it was really terrible. But in other words, that answer becomes a little hollow for the problem of evil. So there have been different interpretations, and I think that in general what it is, it's a jumping off text, a core text for how do we understand why do bad things happen to good people. Captain Sunshine, thank you for your support. This is the first time you've been live to a lecture, but you joined us on Sunday before. Well, wonderful. That's wonderful news. Ricky Palacios. Can the documentary hypothesis be used to explain Q and the synoptic problem? So it's, it's not the same hypothesis, but it's its own kind of documentary hypothesis, right? So Q and the synoptic problem, Q is an answer to a hypothesis that is an answer to the synoptic problem, and Q and the two-document solution is a documentary hypothetical solution to the synoptic problem. There is also a simpler, technically simpler supplementary model that tries to explain, well, Mark is the original text, and then Matthew's an expansion, and Luke somehow expands off of Matthew, and it's hard to explain any of the editorial decisions that are made in order to create that supplementary model for the synoptic problem. But a couple people hold to that, but a couple good scholars hold to that. But I think that the reason why there is much more consensus on a documentary style solution to the synoptic problem is that it's just hard to explain it the other way easily. Even if it's a simpler, technically simpler explanation, there's a much more complicated understanding of what crazy editorial thing the author of Luke is doing, for example. Dartharama says, why is Q necessarily just a sayings gospel? Could it have been a regular gospel that Matthew and Luke treat like Luke's gospel? Maybe there's a third birth story. So if there is a whole bunch of other narrative, it's not possible for that to be Dartharama, because if there's a whole bunch of other narratives, including a completely different third birth story in Q, then somehow Matthew and Luke have deleted almost all of those narrative components of the story for no reason, and they both have done it independently, and just preserved the sayings parts with like two exceptions. There's two narrative stories that are included in sayings. I call it a sayings gospel. There's two narrative stories. There's at least there's the story of Jesus tempted in the desert, and there's the story of the centurion's slave boy getting healed at a distance. And so those are in Q. So there are narratives there, and those are both retained by the authors of Matthew and Luke. If there was a nativity story in Q that they both delete and they both write their own new one, that seems, I think that's an impossible hypothetical to imagine. I think that if there had been a Christmas story there, then they would have just used it and expanded it rather than written their own original nativity story. Ron Wagner says, wasn't most of the Bible changed over time as each book was copied manually? A little bit, but actually it's surprising how little. So in some cases, yes, there's a thing that happens where an editor is expanding, and they may not expand it too much, and they may have just changed it a very little. But what's surprising when we look at these early manuscripts that we find from the Dead Sea Scrolls, in other words, when we look at what does some of the texts of Isaiah look like as of an early manuscript that maybe dates to 300 before the Common Era, it's surprising how little of those scribal changes occur accidentally. So they're doing a pretty good job of maintaining those all the way down to the present. There are textual variances, but they're less substantial than everybody would have imagined they are. So they exist, but I'm surprised by how relatively unimportant. There's some that are there, but relatively unimportant than we would think. Julie Bazuski says, if the stories were interspersed, why didn't the redactor get rid of contrary details like the one pair versus the 7 pairs of clean animals. And so, Julie, what I would just suggest is that the redactor has reverence for all of the source texts. So they're already starting to consider these to be your ancient heritage that are important, and they maybe know the source very well. It's like if you, it's not a particularly good example because the synoptic gospels are so similar right now that combining them together wouldn't really help you very much because they're expansions of, the Luke and Matthew have Mark in it, so it's not really useful. But let's say we had 4 gospels that were all the way different from each other. And then somebody, were to say, look, what's important to me, I want to tell the whole Jesus story. I don't want to have to read 4 different books. And they took those 4 different gospels and they combined them together in a semi-chronological way, even if there were doublet stories that appeared in some cases, then they interspliced them. Because they're already viewed by us as scripture, crossing them out, changing them, deleting parts is not something that we would want to do. And so I get the sense that the final redactor, if a final redactor is combining D along with J, E, and P in order to create the Torah as we had it, then they don't want to delete stuff or fix stuff. So there are some places where fixes have to have been made. So there are places where if the documentary hypothesis is real, a voice has been altered in a couple places to make it fit. And there's at least one story where like a doublet has been combined and the beginning of the one story comes from the one voice and the end of the story comes from the other, and that means that the end of the one and the beginning of the other have been deleted. And so there's a couple deletions that can be seen, but it does seem that the contradictions are allowed to be maintained, perhaps because the redactor reverences the text and doesn't want to have a lot of editorial changes. K. Tempest Bradford says, given the way the different sources favor Moses or Aaron, do you have insight on how Miriam fits into this? What are the origins of her role in all of this? She is also in conflict with Moses sometimes. She's key to the Moses side of the story. So is she from J and E? I'm trying to remember. She's definitely associated, yeah. I mean, a lot of times when Miriam is appearing, she'll be associated with Aaron. I would have to look at how she is portrayed and where that is. I probably should have. So the fact that there's an emphasis on Miriam implies to me that may be a J story because where she's doing something when she does important things, because again the Yahwist voice is the one that tends to emphasize women. But I'd have to look at the individual cases. When she is when she's being denigrated, so that when both she and Aaron, I think, get leprosy and have to be outside the camp, that's probably, again, a J source since it's anti-Aaron, right? But we'd have to look at that. Her running around, Miriam running around, following Moses in the basket and things like that at the beginning would be an E story because the Elohist is very interested in Moses as one of the main heroes. Todd Radmaker, which writer is responsible for the genealogies and where were they added? So all of the begat lists are thought to be a separate voice, a separate story. So there seems to have been a standalone book called the Book of Generations, which was a begat list that's kind of like a antediluvian kings, or patriarchs kind of list where Enosh and Jared and Methuselah and Lamech and all those guys are living 1,000 years. That is an existing book that the redactor intersperses into the sources in order to give the composite whole a structure that is seemingly chronological. So the understanding anyway is that from most documentary source hypothesis scholars is that these are that this voice is a separate voice from a distinct book called the Book of Generations. Nicola, how do the Dead Sea Scrolls fit in with the JEP authors? So, unfortunately, as early as the Dead Sea Scrolls are, they are later than Torah redaction. So they don't fit in unfortunately. It would be wonderful if there was just if we had found a standalone scroll that just had J, and then we would have suddenly realized, okay, this is what the J source actually is, and Tom Elliott Friedman actually believes that the J source actually continues as a distinct voice within the Deuteronomic histories, and so if we had a scrolls or a set of scrolls of J that just had J only, then that would prove a documentary hypothesis, or at least part of it. Instead, though, what they have at Qumran is copies of Torah after the redaction has happened, and so it doesn't give us that insight. So unfortunately, it's not early enough. So it tells us lots of things, important things, but not that. Josh Bedford, do you think that the binding of Isaac is an apologetic against Molech worship, and how would that fit in with J and or E? Yes, it is. So I think it is. So the idea of it is that Canaanite religion, the earlier paganism before the reforms that brought Israelite monolatry together, included infant sacrifice, so the sacrifice of the firstborn of every womb. And so one of the reforms is to eliminate that practice. And so that figures into the Torah story most clearly with the Passover story. So the Passover is a ritual where you sacrifice a substitute, an animal, you sacrifice a lamb or goat or whatever instead of the child, and then you paint its blood as a sign over your lintel in order to show that you've done that, and that preserves your firstborn. Whereas the angel of death, the god of death, takes the firstborn of the Egyptians. And so it's a very clear myth about substitution sacrifice as avoiding the need to have infant human sacrifice. And the same thing is true for the Abraham and Isaac story. So it's presented in the text as a test of Abraham's faith, and that's a terrible test. It's a terrible explanation. If it's a test of Abraham's faith, he failed because you shouldn't kill your kid because God tells you. That's a failure, in my opinion, ethically and theologically. But what the myth is actually doing is, again, Abraham's firstborn by Sarah, the firstborn of every womb is mine, saith the Lord. So in other words, he needs to be sacrificed. But God intervenes and says, no, this practice has to stop. We're not going to have human sacrifice anymore. We're going to have a substitute. Here's a ram. And so now sacrifice the ram instead. And so yes, it fits in, and it's a J or an E story. I think it's anyway, I can't know. I don't know. I'd have to look it up and see what it is, if it's a J or an E story. Ham and She says, is the supplementary hypothesis gaining traction just because it's simpler, or there's some other positive evidence for it that answers specific problems with the documentary hypothesis? I think that simpler is a big plus for it. So people don't like things to have too many hypotheticals, because then you really start positing a lot of things. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why it's gained a lot of traction. I think also there is a increasing consensus for these stories being much later than people originally thought. So people originally wanted to preserve the idea that there could be some historicity or some kernel behind any of these things, or that maybe there's some long-standing oral tradition behind them. And I think now, because there's so much less known, we've had a recent lecture about how the Torah really only becomes really important and authoritative at the end of the Second Temple period, or towards the end of the Second Temple period in the Maccabees time period, in the Hasmonean time period. There's decreasing excitement for an earlier date, and their dates are kind of all getting later. And so I think that because of that, I think that the supplementary hypothesis is gaining traction among people who would see all the texts as being later. So I have a sympathy for the idea that a great literary outpouring happened right at the very end of the First Temple period, the Kingdom of Judah, but I also, it's not proved. So I can see the arguments for the later dates. Mr. Randy Thor says, I heard Dr. Dan McClelland indicate that current scholarship is starting to lean towards classifying the text as P and non-P. Did you come across that in your research? Well, so like I say, P is really, yes, I did, but P is really, like distinct. So you can see the P source for sure. And I think, like you say, it doesn't take a lot once I highlighted, for example, what some of the idioms, the way the P source officiously talks. I think you can, even without a Hebrew version, you can just read it in the English and say, "Ooh, that's a P passage," without too much trouble. Once you start looking at that, so then after that, and that's also the biggest bulk of the text, and so then the rest of it is non-P, but and so that figures into the supplementary hypothesis because, like I say, they've collapsed the idea that J and E are just one non-P source, and so that's effectively what we're talking about with the supplementary hypothesis. But I wouldn't say that current scholarship maybe it's starting to lean that way, but the documentary hypothesis is not fully displaced. Both of these are current. All right. Seeking Something says, my great-grandfather died on Saturday. I've begun to see visions of him in what I believe to be an afterlife. Do visions like this, due to grief, have similarities to the visions of the risen Christ, the accounts of the visions of Jesus? I think that they can have very much similarities. So when we're, experiencing loss, which is part of the human condition, this is a time period when we are more open to reflection on bigger perspective, and that can also inform different spiritual practices that we have, and that can include seeing visions and envisioning loved ones, in your case, and seeing them in an afterlife. And that is not that different from how people who were mourning the loss of Jesus, totally unexpected loss on the cross, had visions of him raised up and seated at the right hand of God. In other words, in a triumph as what they understood to be the Messiah. And so I think that there could be, I don't think that there's any reason to see that as dissimilar. So yes, I'm sorry for your loss, Seeking Something. Mary Magnuson has a comment. I always thought the Bible is the inspired word of God, implying that God is the author. All of this discussion seems to prove that many people created God. So I think that actually, Mary, what we need to say is that this discussion proves that many people created the Bible. The Bible is written, all the words of the Bible are written by humans. The formula that we have in Community of Christ is that Scripture or revelation is human response to the divine. So in the same way that we were talking about, Seeking Something's response to loss, Seeking Something could then write down their reaction, and that would be the human response to that. That doesn't mean that seeking something has created God, but rather, or any of us have created God when we are having that kind of writing, but rather that all we can do is write our personal vision and ideas of what God is, and that would be then limited by our own time and place in history and the limitations thereof. And so that's the case for biblical authors as well. James Sweeney, thank you for your support. James asks, how would I hypothetically join your church? James, you should contact me. So my email address is pastor@centerplace.ca, spelled the Canadian way, Centerplace, and we can talk about it. But essentially, the way that you are part of this church, first and foremost, is this is a church about being in community. And so we try to form sacred community every week. And so we do that in our Sunday services. We have a service at noon Eastern, at 6 p.m. Eastern, where people gather together. We read scriptures. We share prayer, which is a community idea of aspirations that we all have, invoking the divine. We meditate on what we reflect and learn, and we learn lessons, and we talk about things like that. And then we also have this discussion every Tuesday. So this is another component of what is church for us, where we have an open forum where we explore ideas about truth and the meaning of life and how we understand history and theology and philosophy. And so getting into community by being a part of that, by interacting with more people than just me through the chats, by participating in the services, that's essentially how you are part of that community. And then actual membership comes, depending on, if you've been a member already of a different church, through baptism and confirmation, and that allows you to be an official member of the church, which is a charity here in Canada. So Oh, okay. Yeah, so Leandro says there's two different ways you can join. You can join supplementarily or documentarily. So that's not really true. So anyway, so don't forget to like and share this video, subscribe to our channel. Thank you all for being here watching. Thank you for all of the people who made donations and supported tonight. You can always do that at centerplace.ca/donate. Next week, we've got a long requested one, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Be sure to join us. Good night, everybody.